So tonight we're gonna talk about Gregory Bateson's essay, Form, Substance and Difference. And I'm coming at this as a complete unknown. I didn't know him at all. And I was surprised to find he was dead, because what he said in a lot of places in the essay was so topical, so resonant. I mean, all the stuff about the environment and the dangers of the way humanity is behaving sounds very up to date. But in fact, his dates are 1904 to 1890. And he was really, I mean, he was a lot of things. I think he began his career as an anthropologist, but got into cybernetics after the Second World War. And he really saw cybernetics as a breakthrough concept, which, you know, we're going to talk about it, but I'll flag here. I think he fell in love with it because it's dialectical, and he was looking for something that was dialectical because of the sort of impasse he found in psychology, epistemology, and he's also famous, I see, for a theory on schizophrenia. So he's very wide-ranging in his influence. So the essay we're looking at was given in 1970 to the Kostick, you might have to pronounce this for us, Kostick
Society.
Yeah. And again, new to me, but their philosophy, their outlook is the sort of slogan that encapsulates it is: the map is not the territory. So all knowledge being mediated by the human brain means that at best we've got a map. We're not fully conscious of the territory because we're looking at symbols. Our brain is creating symbols out of reality, so that and it's very, very important to distinguish and remind yourself that you're looking at the map and not the actual territory. So that's by way of introduction. So jumping into the argument, I found this whole essay extremely idealist and not that persuasive. I mean, it was full of resonant insights and things that I'd happily agree with, but taken as a whole, I felt it was really missing a sense of capitalism, actually. It was very, it came across to me as very focused on the importance of the idea. And we'll sort of break it down as we go through it. But I'm just flagging at the outset, that's where I'm going to be pushing back, because I know you're enthusiastic about it. So, when he talks about, for example, the idea of us wrecking the environment, he roots that essentially in a false conception, a sort of he sees the problem as Darwinianism, whereas I would see it as the pursuit of profit. So, okay, let's go through bit by bit. So he starts with this really, what he argues is a fundamental philosophical division that he traces back to Pythagoras, which is the question of, and he puts it in different ways, and we'll come on to the Jungian way of putting it in a bit, but he question of the difference between pattern and not substance. So Pythagoras, he argues, stands for pattern, and in this sense is in a tradition that runs through the Gnostics and the alchemists, where they're interested in the holistic pattern of the reality, whereas our modern thought has been dominated by the opposite, by the interest in the substance, by physics, by a sort of cause and effect model, and so it's subsumed what he thinks is actually the helpful tradition, the higher level tradition. So I read this, and one thing that I immediately thought was, where does Plato fit in this division between pattern and substance? Because I felt that Plato, and then running into Russell and Whitehead and Roger Penrose, would be patternnists, not substancists, in which case Bateson is aligning himself with an idealistic tradition that I'm fairly hostile to. And I think that is what's going on, because later on he has this thing about Socrates. And he also mentions Russell as someone who essentially is on his side, I got the impression, but falls into a certain trap. So that's my first question I throw back at you. Is this essentially a Platonistic view?
I don't think it's in any way Platonistic, because it doesn't have any kind of equivalent of a theory of forms. So that's the essential thing about Platonism, and that's a form of substantial. The forms are instantiated in things, so it's not a pattern-based way of seeing things. And I didn't. You sort of taken me slightly by surprise, because I didn't think much about that side of it. I mean, I thought it was an interesting observation when he first made it, about the difference between the Pythagorean approach. And it's not really about Pythagoras. It's just a sort of, beginning with Pythagoras, there's an approach which sees the world as really about patterns versus approaches which see it as really about substances and their interaction. And, my first thought about that is, well, okay, that's an interesting way to look at the world. That's fine by me. I thought he made it really interesting, though. But it's fine by me, but I don't really care much either way until you make something of that. When it became really interesting was when he talked about the problems of philosophical monism and dualism, and the idea that, the difference between the mind and body, or, mind and matter, or something like that, they're really just two different perspectives, where one perspective, the perspective of materialism, is substance-based. It's about causality and so on. Whereas the mind is all about pattern-based. It's about information and difference. Now, from my point of view, I knew that Bateson had something to do with systems theory and cybernetics. And I've always had a really dismal view of cybernetics based on nothing more substantial than to me, the classic cybernetic system is a thermostat. Temperature rises, the thermostat changes, you get negative feedback, and the temperature falls again because you lower the heating. And I've always thought that's that's something you learn as a trainee, an apprentice electronics engineer, as I used to be, like in week one. And it just, without giving much thought to it, it just never interests me, because it doesn't seem to me like you're going to explain a lot by that. But in reading Bateson, I realised how much I'd sort of undersold it, or hadn't really understood what it was about, because I found his point about the pattern-based looking at there's the mind's way of seeing the world. I found that really, really convincing when he talked about sort of classic philosophical problems of, the Kantian Ding and Sick, which I'm just against in principle, the idea that this unknowable bit of reality. I was trained that way to be against it. But when he described it as, if you're looking at the world, you have information about it, and information is infinite. There's no end to the possible information you could have. And in the sense that until you've got all that information, you don't know the object. So in a sense, there's always a residual. And I just thought that was the first time I'd ever heard anyone say anything about Kantianism that I thought that seemed reasonable to me. So I thought that was interesting.
Okay.
Go on.
Yeah. So, first of all, I think that is where it kind of fits a little bit with Platonism. I mean, it's not literally the argument about the pure form and then the shadowy variants, but it's a bit like that. The Ding and Stick is a bit like the unknowable. No, it's not a pure thing. It's even just a rusty nail would have its own infinite ding-ang sickness, but so it's not quite the same. But that resonated. I could see this kind of connection there. I also felt that it wasn't an accident that he mentions Kant but not Hegel, and again we'll come on to this, that he so I actually take the point about the any object is going to have infinite ways of differentiating itself from the rest of the universe, including, like he points out, at the atomic level. But even not at the atomic level, just it's not Alpha Centauri. You know, there's so many ways in which you could feel an object. So that is an interesting point. But where is it leading? And we'll move along probably into that. And the way he moves it into a purposeful argument, and it does, by the way, for anyone listening to this, it does lead somewhere really important. It leads to the meaning of life, of what it is to be a mind, and whether you have an afterlife, and really interesting, conclusions. But to work towards that in his lecture, he first of all has it's almost an aside, but then he loops round to it again. He wants his audience to think about evolution in the light of this observation about pattern versus substance, and about about Kant. So his argument is that evolution as the main model, stretching from Darwin, and he doesn't mention Dawkins, but that would be a definite target of his. It really would be a target of his. That the main model is flawed because their unit of evolution is the biological reproducing unit, and in Dawkins' case, he reduces it even further down to the genes. But for Darwin, it's the creature that's reproducing, and Bateson argues that this is far too narrow to explain successfully how evolution works. He said just one simple point. Evolution works because a population has a lot of diversity. So it has to be thought about at the population level, that there's elements within the population that are going to prosper and survive under changed circumstances compared to others. So the more monotone the unit, especially if you reduce it to an individual, but he makes a very good point about modern human intervention on the planet, that we have created around us a very crude, undiverse crops and animals. And he argues this is not a successful evolutionary strategy. You've got to have a diverse population. That's how natural selection works. So I actually accepted his point there. I thought that's fine, except this, right? He says, any organism that sets to work with a focus on its own survival ends up with a destroyed environment. So there's a kind of irony here, that if you see, it comes back to his systems analysis. So like you say, it's like a thermostat, or he likes the analogy of the steam engine that self-regulates. So as it gets more energy, it lets off, and then it cools down. But that's how he's coming at evolution. And his argument is that if you deregulate because the reproducing unit is able to run away with itself, ironically, its own success will destroy the environment, and therefore it'll become unsuccessful. And his example, he just gives us an example, us, right? That we're heading for catastrophe. And he wrote this in 1970, and he was prescient, definitely. So that's all really strong. But it occurred to me, okay, but are there other examples? Presumably there's loads, but I just don't know them, where the success of a species, like maybe the introduction of a new species in Australia or something, it goes rampant, but then collapses through overgrazing or something. Do you happen to know? Is this a common model? Once you take a system that's no longer got this regulatory feedback and ability to contain itself, has this happened a lot in evolution?
I don't know. I'm not an evolution. Off the top of my head, nothing occurs to me. But let's come back to that actually, because it's a good question. There's got to be examples where, even if they're very isolated examples where you have got a monoculture and a stable environment, and you've got some organism that completely swamps the place and raises that. I mean, that sounds very familiar to me.
Yeah, yeah.
So let's return to that. But I have to say, one aspect of the essay was that it was talking to the Korzybski Society, and therefore I think that he was taking a lot for granted there. I mean, he talked about the introductory thing about Pythagoras and patterns versus substance. It kind of leapt onto evolution, and I think he was assuming a lot there about the topics, because the Korzybski Society is a society of systems people. In the manner of Korzybski, who I knew almost nothing about, apart from the fact that William Burroughs was a big fan. And of course, this saying of his, the map is not the territory. I mean, again, synchronicity, Conor. I happened to post on Facebook just a couple of weeks ago, are you allowed to punch people who say the map? Is it legal to punch people who say the map is not the territory? Because everyone treats it as the ultimate wisdom,
Yeah.
And it's a bit tedious, really. But again, that's not Korzybski's fault, because he was the first to make that observation. But I thought the business about treating, there's two questions here. One is a question about the theory of evolution, and the other is about systems analysis, taking them quite slightly separately. He used a systems analysis approach to do a critique of a certain conception of biology, which in fact is the Dawkins conception.
Yeah.
So I'm fed up. I mean, I didn't think about this until this week. I haven't thought about it for a long time. But I'm fed up with talking to people who say, well, Dawkins is terrible on religion, for example. But, you have to admit he's good on the evolutionary theory, and he absolutely is not. This notion of the selfish gene is completely chimerical nonsense. And, and it is the common sense view. I mean, the reason it's a successful book is not because it was so massively new, but it represents the common sense view of the theory of evolution. The gene, the individual gene, seeks to reproduce itself, to maximize its own gain, and that therefore is the unit of evolutionary reproduction and selection. And he uses a systems point of view simply to say that, in fact, everything is a system. The interaction between the species and its environment, which includes other species, forms a system, and it's those systems that are selected for. And so that was a particular way of critiquing, again, a certain conception of the theory of evolution. There are other ways, though, that, which are, I was going to say, just as powerful. I don't say that to make a criticism of the systems thing. It's a perfectly valid criticism. I thought if anything, it demonstrated the power of that kind of.
Right. And this is going to be important when he comes back to the more controversial analysis of mind, because the critique of evolution, he uses later in the lecture, he loops back from what he's saying that's a bit more controversial. So let's park that and agree with him. I'm happy to agree with him, with minor caveats, because it still leaves a question of, if the unit is the organism in its environment, it still leaves the question of a bigger kind of level of environment, which is exerting pressure for some sort of selective process. But I'm happy enough to absolutely, definitely keen to get away from the reductionist kind of evolution to a more holistic one. Right. So then it gets onto the question of mind. And he starts by drawing a useful distinction, I think, that let's think about this analogy about the map is not the territory. What gets onto the map? And it's not, he wants to argue, not the physical, the river, the mountain, or at least insofar it is those things. It's because they're different to their surroundings. So for him, it's all about difference. And unlike the hard sciences where you've got impacts and forces creating effects, the world of communication is about differences. And the quote from him in the essay is, in the world of mind, nothing can be a cause. An absence can be a cause. So in the world of physics, you've got to have a billiard ball smashing into a billiard ball. But in the world of communication, saying this hasn't happened. That could be really important. Oh my, what, it hasn't happened. Okay, let's respond very dramatically to nothing. So yeah. So he thinks that a lot of mental processes are attempted to be understood by analogy with hard science, with molecular interactions and so on. And he thinks that just creates a lot of nonsense and errors. Including what's happening in the brain when we receive inputs, because he says that we tend to speak about as a misleading metaphor. We say what travels in the axons of the brain is an impulse, like an electrical impulse. And he's not keen on that, because that kind of neuroscience is reductionist, and it's not about map creation. What creates the map is the message. And he's saying this what's often called an impulse is really news of a difference. So your eye is telling you these things are different, and your fingers are telling you these things are different. That all the time they're informing us that things are different, and therefore we're dealing with a language, not cause and effect. It's not like, oh, the pin sends I'm hurt. That feels different. And therefore, the world of the mind is much, much bigger than the world of the skin, because we are in communication with the universe around us. Starlight, he doesn't give this example, it just occurred to me, right? We're in communication with different stars. That can be considered a system in his sense. Me looking at a star. I mean, he uses systems like a man hitting a tree with an axe forms a system where there's marks on the tree showing you where to hit and so on. And therefore the process that's taking place is not just a physiological one at all. It's best understood as a system where there's a mind, and it turns out a very limited form of mind compared to his big picture mind, and you could say that he would say, I'm not too keen on this, he would say that you can consider the whole system, so including the exterior. I'm not sure he'd even accept the distinction between interior and exterior. That's what the mind is.
I'm very struck by that, and I agree with it. It's my instinct is that that's absolutely right. And he's not the first person I've heard say that. There's a lot of people, modern neuroscientists, who talk about the mind in those terms, that, in perception, your mind is in contact with things external to the body. It really is the mind is in contact. The mind is distributed across, a system of things which may be connected causally, but one way or another, your mind exists distributed across space and time, often in memory and things like that. And I really like this idea for a number of reasons. One is that it just wires straight around the usual Cartesian dualism. And when people talk about Cartesian dualism as if it was a kind of physics, the physics of mental substances versus physical substances, really it's just an impression that they have, that they themselves are different from matter. They can't imagine these two things, how they could interact, mind and matter. Well, to see mind as just inherently embedded in the world is fantastically materialistic. Maybe this will help you get over your knee-jerk response about some of these things. To see mind as distributed in that way is incredibly materialistic. And there's another kind of distribution as well. It's not only distribution beyond the cortex, as it were, or the center of the brain, where the mind is supposed to hide. It's also a distribution inside the brain and the body, because in fact there are many different, from a systems point of view, many different psychic systems at work in the mind, in both the conscious and the unconscious. Many of them overlap and interact, many of them don't. some of them are conscious, many of them aren't conscious. And modern neuroscience is much more in tune with the subjective side of this. So that, after many years of really quasi-behaviorism, now, and all that behaviorism was really a product of the fact that you could suddenly put probes in people's brains, buzz them around, and you could measure stuff like that. And scientists got quite excited about that and basically expelled talk of the subjective. But the subjective is very much back in neuroscience. So, there are a whole series of neuroscientists now, people who combine neuroscience with psychoanalysis. So you have neuropsychoanalysts now who are trying to marry Freud and neuroscience directly. And the things they talk about are very much about subsystems within the brain that deal with different kinds of information processing. And I mean, I don't want to over-egg this, but there's talk among them of being able to measure the amount of consciousness in a system. And then some of them would say that, for example, the internet must be at some level conscious, even if it's at a very, very low level, because of the kind of processing it does. So they've put a lot of work into formulating some of them quite precise theories about what type and level of information processing must be taking place to produce consciousness. And, and the level of consciousness is in proportion to this number that they derive. But the point about that is that because there are many different subsystems in the brain, there are many different parts of the brain and the mind operating with different levels of consciousness. And that seems to me to be much more compatible with our actual knowledge of brains and how they work. The strain, the Oliver Sacks-like phenomena you get when people suffer different kinds of brain damage, these very, very precise and peculiar effects on the mind, and not just the brain, on the mind, and how the person perceives themselves, perceives the world, and so on. We know from this that there are weird subsystems at work, possibly even multiple personalities all competing for attention in each of us, certainly different levels of awareness and different consciousnesses which achieve focus at different times. So I find that this notion, I'm not voting for the systems approach here because I don't know enough about it to do that. But the aspect of it which says that mind is a function of a system of relations, and that those relations are both in the brain but also outside the brain, distributed around the body in some sense, distributed outside the body in other senses. I find that tremendously exciting. And it is, by the way, very compatible with Freudianism. Freud had the idea that you in some sense, stuff came in, sensations, but it was processed by the body. And the body produced other kinds of drives as a result of those sensations, both internal sensations, I feel hungry, and external ones. But also there were different levels of sensations going on, and through to quite a high level of conscious awareness. But obviously, as we all know, he also talked very much about unconscious processes. And he tried to connect all those things with the physiology of the body and the mind. And I think that the neuroscientists are now doing that much more successfully than Freud ever could do, for the obvious reason that they didn't have the science and technology then to look into the brain the way they can now. But they're doing that, and I think what they're finding is compatible with what we know from our own experience and from the history of psychiatry and psychology, producing a much more rich and complex picture of the human mind than ever before. And I think that that the systems approach that Bateson represents both reflects those things and makes them possible, and also feeds into one of my other prejudices, which is panpsychism. By also stretching the mind outside of the body, you're hooking it up with other things which can be said to possess consciousness of a sort.
Yeah. I think that you were, careful with your choice of words in a way that makes it all very plausible. He's less careful in this essay. He goes so far as to say the territory is ding en sick, and you can't do anything with it. So that's a more extreme formulation. And again, he says all phenomena are literally appearances. And that's going a bit too far for me, because to say that there's a sense in which mind, I liked this, and he puts it well when he says what Freud did in extending the mind into the unconscious, I'm doing by extending the mind outside. Okay, that's interesting. That is potentially liberating. I can see that there is some value in talking about a form of mind that is inclusive of the environment around it. But then to say that all phenomena are literally appearances and that the territory is unknowable, that you can't do anything with it. Well, I wish he was still around to ask him what he meant by that, because clearly we can do.
You'd have to be quite, you'd have to be quite motivated to argue that he therefore believed that technology wasn't possible. I mean, he clearly did, in many, many ways. So he can't be saying that. And I also think the other business of the phenomena literally are only appearances is just a sort of verbal quip, because phenomena, that's what they are. They're phenomena, they're not nomina. They're not the noumena, the thing, they're just the appearance. Now, Hegel would say, essence shines forth, essence appears, is what he would say. And that's why you like Hegel, because he connects essence and appearance, the noumena and phenomena. But that is only a verbal trick on Hegel's part. I mean, to actually connect essence and phenomena is something you have to do with technology and meaningfully. So I think there's the danger of worrying too much about some of the forms.
Yeah, okay. I'll cut him some slack as well, because he's giving a lecture. So this isn't his polished notes. This is him. Often when you're speaking to an audience, you kind of exaggerate a little bit just to really push an idea across. Okay, we'll say that he's more in keeping with the way you phrased it, typically. And let's move on to Jung, because this is remarkable. Unless you'd already got the connection, I was surprised how we only talked about Jung last week and 2 weeks ago, and here we have Jung again, and this again in a very favorable way, and again in a way that connects to the alchemists and the Gnostics. And it's quite funny, Bateson. He says Jung was hearing all these ghosts, which Bateson obviously doesn't believe in at all. He said his real crisis was a crisis of epistemology, and he solved it, and he got rid of the ghosts by getting on with his work and writing 7 sermons to the dead, which I now want to read in the light of our last 2 discussions. And he points out that Jung signed 7 sermons to the dead as Basilides, a famous Gnostic, and he appropriates Jung's distinction between pleroma and creatura, substance and mind. So it's the same kind of distinction he was working on himself, but he's recognized it in Jung. And the creatura is the world seen as mind. So that's the pattern. It's the pattern versus the substance again. Pleroma is the substance. And he says that the creatural description is always hierarchic, by which he means that unlike the sort of atomistic cause and effectness of the pleroma, the creatura have got levels and levels and levels. And like what you were saying about subsets of the brain, he sees those systems that are forming and reforming at all different levels, so that not only are we looking at differences when we perceive senses, but we're also analyzing those differences, and we're aware of transformations within the differences. And this is where he runs into Russell, because he says, in this context, I will only lightly touch on the problem of classes of difference, because to carry the matter further would land us in problems of Principia Mathematica. And this is, I'd already, at the start of the essay, thought, this is kind of Russell and Whitehead stuff. And I don't think I'm wrong. I think that there's, which is a weakness, as we discussed when you talked about banging one's head against the wall, if Bateson's ideas do run him into that problem of how to understand these hierarchies, if it comes down to actually producing sort of models that work, and he ends up with a kind of I don't know, a sort of an iteration that brings him all the way into first principle kind of territory, that would be a big headache for him. It was a passing thing that he said, but I just thought it was a coincidence that a bit of me had already started to worry this was a feature of his system.
Well, I don't know how rigorous these people are in terms of the mathematics of, the way they're describing systems. You've talked about the founders of cybernetics, von Neumann and people like that. They're very rigorous mathematical approaches. So I suppose at some point they're going to have to face the kind of problems that Russell and Whitehead and people face with incompleteness and things like that. Formal problems of set theory. But that would be a problem in how you describe these systems. I don't think it would make the systems approach, which I don't have any particular commitment to, but nevertheless, I don't think it would make it fall over in and of itself. It would mean that your tools weren't quite right for dealing with it. So you'd have to perhaps augment your approach or whatever. I found the thing about the hierarchy is tremendously important because, again, it fits very closely with the idea that mind is organized in that way, that there are, sub-personalities within the personality, but also instincts within sub-personalities. And I'm just making up these categories, but you can imagine whatever form they take, and nevertheless, they're quite hierarchically structured. And there are structures that are meta the individual in one way or another, and quite plausibly structures that are cosmos-wide, that sort of idea of immanence. So again, I'm less worried about the formal stuff. I'm not poo-pooing it. I'm not saying, I think it's worth marking up there. But I suppose I just don't think about things that as much. That it's not a major problem for me to overcome. I'm not going to get stuck at the hurdle. Does set theory, because set theory has a problem, does systems theory have a problem? I don't really know, but I do know that the way he's talking about mind on the basis of systems theory is very, very plausible. And maybe that's not because of the systems theory. Maybe that's because of some features of the systems theory that you could abstract. But nevertheless, it's extremely powerful. I think it's worth noting at this point that I read the essay backwards, in the sense that I was introduced to the essay by a friend of mine who quoted a long section from the very end of it. It was on Facebook, so I read that. And that's where he ends up talking about how this idea of the hierarchical nature of mind and creatura, the creatura way of looking at things leads to a different way of thinking of the human mind, which is a non-Cartesian way, which again is very much in line with modern neuroscience, where there's no longer this single point of ego, that's at the center of all brain and mental processing. There's something much more distributed at work. And he writes really beautifully at the end of the essay about how that means that intelligence is distributed through the brain, and it doesn't always take the form of verbal intelligence. And this reminded me very much of what I'd been reading recently about, the nature of poetry, why we have poetry. And I'm reading an analysis of Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience, and the guy writing this stuff was saying that Blake tries to give you in Songs of Innocence an experience of innocence, not a formula about what innocence is, but a kind of an intimacy with it, an awareness of what it is. So that will make you a different person later on. You might be able to summon up that awareness in future. It can modify your behavior, and it forms part of your intelligence, but it's not a verbal kind of intelligence. And of course, nobody has a problem if you say, well, riding a bike isn't a verbal form of intelligence. Everybody gets that, that's a real skill. Playing tennis. You can write a book about playing tennis, but playing tennis is more than the theory of it. And he just writes beautifully at the end of this essay about this distributed nature of mind means there are different ways of having intelligence within the mind, including, you know, he mentions dancing, but he talks about taking, you know, acid, LSD, and that how that gave him a different sort of awareness of the mind. So this is a man writing in the 70s. Though he wouldn't have been the first person to write in this vein. You know, there's Aldous Huxley, there's William Blake, there's people like that. But he's coming at it from a cybernetics, mathematics point of view, and I find that quite impressive. You know, the
very impressive. And I do want to come up, especially to Blake, because you know you've expertise in that. That's really worth hearing, and I want to hear your take on it. But I'll keep going on the path that he structured his lecture, as much for my benefit as anyone who listens to kind of hear how the argument closes, because we're getting to the nub of it now. Because so his argument is that we have these creatura, that the mind has got these hierarchies and patterns, and that he takes the example of a man cutting the tree, and argues that the mind is, we have to see the unit at work as being not the way you put it just there was not the ego interacting with the tree, and there's a sort of the shutters have come down between the two. There's some sort of guillotine has come down between the two, and the process is understood as me, the tree. He says it's better to understand them as a dispersed mind in a system, and that the system is operating, and the system changes. I actually made a note to myself. I said, yeah, this is all very well, but what if he wants a drink? And Bateson, in the next example, says, of course, when he goes for dinner, it's a different system. So they're very fluid, these systems and the boundaries, but he doesn't want to put the boundary between the biology of the human and outside. He wants to put the boundaries in a kind of circle around a process. Me, the tree, the axe, the whatever comes into that process. And this is where it comes back to evolution, because he said just as evolutionary theory puts the boundary too tightly down the biological organism, and therefore it doesn't really work. That's the same straitjacket. He didn't use that analogy. That's the same problem, error, a sort of understanding error that happens when we put the line at our biology, at our brain, at our ego, let's give a quote. I think helps it. Right. So this is him referring back to his point about evolution. So he reminds us of his evolutionary argument. And then he says, in precisely the same way, it makes no sense to cut the unit of evolution off by delineating the line at the biological body. The unit of evolution is a completed pathway, a system. And that's what the mind is. So the mind is a pathway, it's a system. The way to delineate the system is to draw the limiting line in such a way that you do not cut any of the pathways in ways that leave things inexplicable. So, when you go down the Cartesian road, he's arguing, you end up with inexplicable things, because you've got this false dichotomy between the person and the environment. The person is part of the environment. So this is all good, don't cut the brain off from the axe in the tree, and that circuit is coming away from a different circuit. But it obviously leads to the question of how much of me is outside of me. Is this, what, and he does address it, to be fair. What does it mean to think of yourself as not your...
And he says, I find this almost impossible to do.
Yeah.
Very difficult to do. But that is because, it's so interesting this, because I ended up, you'll remember I was reviewing a book about William Blake, a new book by John Higgs. And he ends up talking, in trying to describe Blake's view, he ends up describing over and over again the absolutely classic empiricist situation, which is the blank slate of the mind. Experience comes in and impresses itself on the mind and creates images and then ultimately concepts by simple association and all this kind of thing. And it's so plausible to people. I mean, I don't think this the chap John Higgs had read much philosophy, he just finds that the obvious way to think about the mind. It's common sense. And that's what even Bateson is saying. He can't get out of that. He can't get himself out of that. And that's how deeply we're buried in this ideology. But one thing we know about that picture is that it is utterly, utterly false. I was reading just yesterday about hydrocephalic children. That is, children whose entire cortex has been, it was never there. It's taken away in utero by, well, it doesn't really matter, but they don't have a cortex. Now, according to neuroscientists, that means they can't have experience. They can't experience anything. Anyway, so I was reading about this group of hydrocephalic children in Disneyland, playing games, happy, and so on and so forth. And it's literally inexplicable from the empiricist point of view and from a traditional neuroscientific point of view, which assumes that somewhere in the cortex there is the
processor,
blank slate, or the thing that is that experiences things, like a viewer at the cinema. But in fact, it isn't there. And in fact, and it's also very interesting that that Freud understood a lot of this. When he even describes vision, he talks about how in the prefrontal cortex and the lower levels of the brain, how they process information. He says at no point is there raw information. For example, we're talking about vision. At no point is there raw information coming in, which is then given to the cortex, which looks at it. It's actually processed several times by different systems before it gets to the cortex. And he says that at no point is it legitimate to say, well, before that point, it isn't mental, and after that point, it's mental. It's all mental, right from, the beginning to the end. And as Bates would say, extending it outside of, the eyes and things like that. I found actually a beautiful, I've got to mention it since we're talking about it, a beautiful thing that Blake talks about the different levels of vision. But the first distinction he makes is between Newtonian vision, where you just see things in three-dimensional space, and then, and another level of a higher level of vision in which things have meaning, and you see, it's the level at which he sees angels and things like that. But I was amazed to discover that there are, according to modern contemporary neuroscience, there are two areas of visual processing in the brain that are quite distinct, but connected. And one of them, if it's damaged, you lose all sight. You can't see anything in the sense that we normally mean by that. You don't see any color, anything. But if the other one is damaged, you can see everything, but you can't see anything either, because nothing means anything to you. You can't see it. Nothing represents a form, but all the visual imagery is there. The Newtonian single vision, as Blake would put it, is there. But another part of the mind is involved in further processing of that. But at no point is there just, this single mind doing all the work. So again, I really welcomed all this, spilling the mind out through different levels of the brain and taking it outside of the body. I love the idea that when light from a distant star strikes your eye, it connects you with that star. There's something deeply profound about that. I like the idea.
I like that. That's my idea as well. It's not in Bateson. This is how Bateson puts it, right? He says he says it's very hard to adopt this way of thinking where you surrender yourself. He says, I still think Gregory Bateson is cutting down the tree. I am cutting down the tree. Myself is, to me, still an excessively concrete object, different from the rest of what I've been calling mind. And he says that the times he's overcome that, like you said, were when he took LSD, and in particular, he was listening to music. And he had an epiphany, a sense that he and the music were one, that it wasn't him listening to music anymore. It was one system. Him and the music formed a system. So I thought you'd like that. And then the other example he gives is poetry, and in particular Blake. And he says that when Blake says the poetic imagination was the only reality, that's close to what he's saying. And he qualifies it quickly by saying, of course, I believe in science, but this overcoming of a rootedness, a concrete sense of I into the system is
You might think
possible in poetry.
when Blake talks about Urizen, who's his, demon of reason,
Yeah,
and broadly speaking, the bad guy, there's a very romanticized way of seeing that as he's simply a bad guy. But Blake sees him in a much more rounded way as a necessary evil in a way, as a limit to energy, a form, an outer form of energy. And so again, as a necessary evil. But an example of that could be our image of the Cartesian mind, the Cartesian view. It's a product of science. There's a very old science, but it's a trap. It's not that it actually is false, I suppose, ultimately, but it's one way. It was a form of development of mind. It's how we've been thinking for the last few hundred years. It's connected with science, isn't it? Because a lot of our science is done from that point of view. A lot of our art is, when people paint in perspective, in strict perspective, they're painting from that point of view. But it's also a sort of prison, It's so getting out of that common sense point of view is doable, because Bateson is saying he's done it. In poetry, in taking LSD, in listening to music, he's done it, and we can do it. But it's also a good example of our relationship to rational thought and science of a particular kind, because it's science of a particular kind. It's the development. I hate talking about the Western mind, because I'm always reading people are dissing the Western mind. You don't know what they're talking about, basically. But nevertheless, it is a product of the development of the Western mind at a certain point in history, and also a massive trap. And that's what he's saying about, that's his dialectic of enlightenment. Because we have taken that Cartesian point of view, because we see everything as transcendent and not immanent, we see ourselves as outside the world. That's why we're in an ecological mess. And that is not unlike, Adorno and Horkheimer talking about the dialectic of enlightenment, how science has become a trap for us, scientism.
It's got to be said to his great credit that the scale of the environmental emergency that he prophesied in 1970 has come around.
So scientists love this shit. That is a prediction, Conor. That's a prediction that he made, and he was bang on. He was talking. Yeah. How much time have we got left? And I was quite surprised. I read it's like he's saying that in 1970.
I know, and if you'd have heard that then, you'd be saying, no way. In the year 2020, we're going to be living in luxury and with all the beautiful things that science has made for us. We're going to have,
I hope. I don't know what I'd have said back then. In 1970, probably was, but it shows the profundity of his thought, actually. And Bateson is not someone I'm that familiar with. I've come across him a few times, and every time I've come across him, it's been isolated quotes and a few pages of something he'd written that's been someone's referred me to. And I've always found that he's thinking differently to the rest of the pack.
Yeah,
I think that kind of thinking in 1970 is impressive. I find that much more interesting about his thought than the formal stuff about, how closely is he going to get? Will he stumble in the end over, set theory? I don't care. I mean, he's already done he's dead, for God's sake. I mean, he's not going to stumble.
Well, he's not, though. By his own theory, he's not dead, because there are systems that still contain his thought, and because he's an idealist, he thinks that the power of thought is everything. So he annoyed me a bit when he gave the example of Socrates and said that the Socrates lives on. I can give you the quote, maybe. The contents of the skin are randomized at death, and the pathways within the skin are randomized, but the ideas undergo further transformation, may go out in the world in books or works of art. Socrates as a bioenergetic individual is dead, but much of him still lives as a component in the contemporary ecology of ideas. And I just thought, yeah, but what about Socrates' slaves? If this is true, isn't it an elitist theory that's...
No, because he's used some corny examples, canonical examples, Socrates' thought, But it applies to everybody. You live on. I mean, I find it the dangerous thing in that is that it sounds a bit like Karl Popper's third world, where there's this sort of neutral world of ideas somehow that we all, which is quite platonic actually. And I don't, I wouldn't want to take the stuff that way. I find it tremendously exciting, the idea that if my mind extends outside my body, then some of the things you just quoted him saying are going to be true. I suppose there's something, I have to confess and say that what I'm reading this in Bateson and saying, why he excites me is that I agree with him. He didn't have to convince me terribly about this, because that's the way my thought has been going. But I find it exciting to discover that people like him were thinking these thoughts. They're new thoughts to me.
Yeah.
I find it quite exciting to see him run with some ideas, which are basic ideas of Korzybski and systems theory, and turn them into a powerful prediction of our future in terms of ecology, and a powerful description of what's in the mind.
Yeah.
Things that, again, you and I as philosophy undergraduates were taught about Locke and Hume and then so on through to Kant and Hegel and whatever it was they taught us. But it was all conceived, even though we were probably warned against this, it was all conceived completely idealistically. Even your materialism is completely idealistic materialism. You want to know the words on the page don't give any succor to idealism. It's all sort of at the level of the terminology and theory. But what Bateson is talking about is about thinking really materialistically about the mind, about what the mind actually is, the actuality, right? There's no Platonic forms in his picture of the mind. There are different levels of organization, yeah, but they're not. They're not. He's not saying that at the expense of matter, even though he's prioritizing form over substance. He's not abolishing matter from the world. He's saying, but what he is saying is that if you look at it in terms of substance, you come to a very different view of reality, of your mind's role in reality. And it's a view in which you can see, without that view, we're heading towards an ecological catastrophe. And with that view, you can understand what it's like to listen to music or poetry. And that's absolutely right. That's right. He's bang on. And to me, this is my cheating kind of ontology. Anything bang on is materialism. Anything that's an adequate description of reality is materialism. I'm not scared of the word idealism anymore. It would be worth going back and reading people like some of the Cambridge Platonists of the 19th century, who are the people that Bertrand Russell hated. He failed, right, because he tried to prove that the Cambridge Platonists were wrong. That's what he tried to prove. And he tried to prove you could build a system based on it. You can't. And that actually, his refutation of idealism is wrong. So let's not worry too much about, the timeless war between idealism and materialism.
Yeah, there's a lot in it that's it is refreshing, and I do take those points. You said that he felt kind of unique, that he has a different way of looking at the world that really heartened you because it fits with the trajectory you're on. Well, I felt that funny enough, he doesn't mention it himself, but it seemed to me there was a lot in common with Buddhism and Zen Buddhism especially. Because, funny enough, the guy with the axe, because it reminded me of one of the Zen koans of the master running him with the axe. And because especially when he's saying about the the system is outside of the ego, that it's this connection, because I think there's a great emphasis in that thought in being at one with a bigger universe. And he does talk about God. And funny enough, I'm not going to hang him on that because he's quite clear he's not talking about a transcendent God at all. And he's saying you may want to use this label.
I mean, if you want to be, you can think of the Zen Buddhist, the aspect of Buddhism that you're representing here as being a critique of essentialism. There's no mind, no thing, there is no essence, realizing that. And that is not so far off just saying that everything is mind.
Yeah.
Everything is there's no Cartesian ego mind substance here. That's what disappears in meditation. But it's not a million miles away from saying, everything is distributed,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So his concept, just for the finally, really, is that the mind is immanent in the universe, and at a high level, that's the universe is mind. It is God, and we are subsets. We are sub systems with our little minds.
And our group minds, actually. I remember saying, I've said to you a few times, I remember working in the AMM, the Association of Musical Marxists, the group I used to be in. And that did have a group mind. Everybody hates group minds because that's cults, isn't it? But that's absolute, that's again, Cartesian paranoia. It's not my mind, therefore it's something terrible. Actually, I find it very powerful, working communally, collectively, towards a common aim. I don't mean in the sense of all labouring in the coal field together, but in the sense of thinking together, produce much more powerful stuff than me grinding away at the same problem by myself. And so there are many different levels at which these different levels exist. I don't think it's just us and the cosmos. I think there are, an infinite number of points of mediation, not only between us and the cosmos, but between the cosmos passing through us down to, protozoa and beyond.
Yeah, but it's a very, like he says, it's a very hierarchical set of patterns. Quite clearly, there's a different hierarchy at work in us talking now and two atoms swirling around each other.
Some difference, surely. All right, should we wrap this one up, Conor?
Yeah. Yeah.
And we haven't decided what to talk about next, but we'll do that offline and maybe take things in a slightly from a bit of a tangent. I find it in a really interesting and to me very useful way. Even though we're not trying to, we keep ploughing the same furrows because these
amazing. Yeah.
Connected. Yeah. So I'm quite happy to go even further afield and see how that connects back, because I'm sure.
Good. Yeah, let's try something that's not obviously got to do with some of the kind of the way that Jung has fitted with this, has fitted with panpsychism, and Blake has come into everything. Let's pick something that's not obviously going to do that and see if it still does.
All right, then. I'll see you in a couple of weeks.